Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk with you because I'm in the middle of finishing a new book, which will be called Humble Consulting. And it's really a follow on to my original work on process consultation, and then the book called Helping, where I tried to be more general about what it really takes to be a good helper. And then the book called Humble Inquiry, where I uh, rather angrily pointed out that Western culture has gone berserk with believing that the heroic way to be is to keep telling people things, and undermines the whole concept of asking questions or building relationships through a more humble inquiry note. So that's kind of the background. But the trigger of the current book is really that while we all say relationships are important, groups are important, teams are important, coaching is important, we've really never gone to the trouble of explaining what we mean by a relationship. So I thought that maybe if I really believe that good help and good consulting requires having a relationship with someone, I ought to tackle what that would actually mean. And of course, it immediately leads to two other words that we always use and rarely define, which is the word openness and the word trust. And yet we are prepared to say, I suspect, that if you're going to build a team, or if you're going to do coaching, or if you're going to be a consultant, it's going to be very important to have a trusting, open relationship, right? Nod your heads if that makes sense to you. All right, good. Because if that doesn't make sense to you, we're dead in the water. But I really do think that's the key. So, what I wanted to do first was to dig a bit into the sociology of relationships. What do we really mean? And what I think we mean when we say we have a relationship is that we have a certain amount of ability to predict someone else's behavior. If it's a very superficial relationship, we can at least predict that they're not going to suddenly harm us, or that they're going to suddenly be rude to us or whatever. And if it's a very intimate relationship, we know that we can more or less predict how they will react to things, what some of their feelings are, and how they view the world. And what I realized is that if we look at the theories of consulting that are out there, they always have an important principle which they call professional distance. Professional distance means don't get too close to your client. To put it in the extreme, you're not supposed to have an intimate relationship with your clients. And the same logic applies to bureaucratic relationships, the transactional stuff we do in organizations. We kind of think that bosses and subordinates ought to maintain professional distance, not to get too close with each other, because we think that leads to nepotism and favoritism and difficulty in making assignments. So then I thought about the helping relationship and realized that if you maintain professional distance, if you go through a very formal process of diagnosing and analyzing and then making recommendations, you're only going to be helpful with very simple transactional kinds of problems where the client knows exactly what they want and you, the consultant helper or team member, know exactly how to do the diagnosis and make recommendations. It's a beautiful model, except you know that it doesn't work very well when you get into open systems, complex, multicultural, complicated kinds of problems. And so this book says, look, that traditional model, which I'm calling a level one relationship, the transactional relationship which we have with strangers, that model is dead in terms of the future of what kinds of issues and problems managers and leaders and consultants face today, where even the diagnosis is impossible because there are multiple constituencies, multiple clients, complex systemic interactive problems, and there is no survey, there is no interview process that's going to resolve all those complexities into a simple diagnosis from which you can make a simple recommendation. So I'm saying in those more complex problems, we need to escalate the relationship to level two. Level three is intimacy. And we've said, no, that's not so good. We don't want to sleep with our clients necessarily. There are a lot of reasons not to want to do that. However, we do have to get to the point where we trust our clients and they trust us, and where we feel the client, the team member, the subordinate is being really open with us. And that's where I see the problem. In almost every organization that I go to and ask the boss, are your employees open with you? Do they really tell you what's on their mind? Do they really tell you when something is going wrong, when quality or safety is being compromised? They tend to say, I kind of think they do, but they realize that they're not very confident. And when I go to those organizations and talk in focus groups, say to the employees, guess what? They say, of course I don't tell him, because he's not really interested. He doesn't want to hear about all the problems with quality and safety that we see, because that interferes with his need to stay on schedule and be productive. So unless the boss makes a real effort to create a climate where the subordinate will really want to tell everything he or she knows, or now putting it into the helper consultant context, unless the consultant makes a real effort to get out of the level one distance relationship and says, I really want to hear what's on your mind. I'm prepared to deal with the complexity and all the issues that you may not yet have told me about. If the consultant doesn't do all that, they will never get around to working the right kind of a problem. So the goal of the boss, the consultant, the team member should be to create a climate where the other person will really tell you honestly what's on their mind in relation to the problem that you're trying to work. It doesn't mean being more personal means you have to talk about everything, but it does mean you have to talk about what's relevant to the problem that you're trying to solve. So a level two relationship is a more personal relationship. than the bureaucratic level one stranger relationship that we tend to take for granted. So nod your head if this concept of moving to level 2 makes some sense to you. I hope I see a lot of heads nodding because it makes a lot of sense to me. So anyway, how do we get to this level 2 is really the dilemma of the helper. And I'm arguing that the way you get there is through personalizing the relationship. You assume that getting a little closer to your client or your team member or your subordinate by treating them not as being in a role. They're not just the subordinate or just the client. They are an actual human being, a total human being. And so it might be quite appropriate for the helper to say, tell me a little bit more about yourself. Do you have a family? Where do you live? You know, who are you? And consider that to be appropriate to building the relationship. And I'm sad to say I see relatively little of that. Doctors have so little time with their patients that they don't really get around to getting to know their patients. They only listen to the very limited diagnostic stuff. The consultant who wants money is likely to jump immediately into say, well, I've got a survey that will get you to diagnostic information as to what problem you have. All the client may have said is, I think I'm worried about the fact that my employees aren't engaged enough. Now, I could immediately, if I'm selling surveys, say, okay, I can measure that for you, and I'll, for X thousand dollars, I'll give you a lot of data about how engaged your employees are. But consider, have you really found out what this person is actually worried about? Have you even asked the question, well, what do you mean by engagement? Or if it's a more personally oriented question, what do you mean by you're worried about it? What are you worried about? The question of what are you worried about or what do you mean by engagement is what I would mean by beginning to personalize the relationship and not just jump into, okay, engagement, know what that is, I'm going to diagnose that for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the personalization process, the goal of that is let's figure out what's really going on here. And very likely the client will consider that kind of important. Yeah, I appreciate your being a little bit interested in me and trying to find out why I'm worried or what I mean by engagement. And what we will then discover is that even that personalization process will be viewed by the subordinate or the team member or the client as helpful. They will get a clearer picture of what it is they're trying to do. And they will thank you for beginning the process, not with jumping in with all your diagnostic and other paraphernalia, but with getting interested in them as a total human being with worries and problems and concerns and agendas. So personalization, a level 2 relationship, leading to then what do we then think of as an intervention? Or what should the consultant then do? And here I align myself with the dialogic people. You may all be aware that Gervais Bush and Bob Marshak have been pushing for the last 10 years the idea that we have to differentiate dialogic OD from diagnostic OD. and that the dialogic accepts the fact that problems are open-ended, that there are no simple diagnostics or simple solutions, but that a different kind of conversation, a more open, trusting conversation, will lead us to thoughts and ideas of how one could adaptively respond to the situation. So in the book, what I'm calling the adaptive move is the idea of what the helper, the boss, the consultant should be doing. They should, first of all, think in terms of adaptive rather than solution. There may not be a solution, but there may be some way we can push things forward. Something that will be adaptive and that will reduce your worry a little bit. Knowing that even as we're doing that, the problem may change, the world is moving very fast, and that there is no point not figuring that maybe in a week or two or a month, we will have to do something different, having a new adaptive move. And so I chose the word move as deliberately being kind of just something you do maybe only once. And until you get a response, you don't really know what your next move is. Versus interventions that are planned out over a long period of time with markers and dates and so on. That won't work on these complex problems that I'm imagining are out there more and more. Whereas adaptive moves will. And those adaptive moves start with your personalization move from the moment you first encounter the client. There is no scouting, there is no diagnostic period, there's no exploration, there's no contracting. There is an immediate personal contact between you and another human being, and the process of helping, consulting, or supervising or leading starts in that moment. That's the essential message. I've been listening to myself, and I think I've said it about as well as I can. So I will, at this point, turn it back over to Philip and Henry and see what you make of it.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic.
Hello.
I'm Monica.
Who are you?
Monica from Australia.
Tell me who you are.
Hey?
Tell me who you are.
Monica, and I'm from Australia, Adelaide. And I've been working with Phil and Henry and the team for about 6 years, and working as a consultant for the last 20. So what you were talking about was moving from level 1 to level 2 and personalising the service.
You know, I have to stop you because the combination of the technology and the accent, I'm not really getting your message very well. I can also interrupt for just a moment because it may be that some of the difficulty will be cleared up if I put my hearing aids in. It may, you know. I normally hear pretty well, but there's a additional factor. So why don't you take 2 minutes to talk among yourselves? I'll be back in 2 minutes, and then I want to talk to you, and I think I will hear you better. Okay?
Fine. I would like to add, I do not have an accent.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter, when he was running for president, when he used to talk in the South, he used to say, elect me president and finally we'll have someone in the White House who doesn't speak with an accent. He had a very strong Southern accent. Why don't we line up a couple of questions while Ed is doing that? You want to? Any other people want to? So you want to come close? So we'll find a chair near here, Michelle, and then we'll. Anybody else?
Should I state my question?
No. Just.
Okay, just be
Okay,
You
I'm
near
back.
boss. Anybody else? Okay, we've got Monica. We need you back, without your accent. This time without your accent.
Okay. I will stop me if you cannot understand.
It's already better.
What I was commenting on was the move from level 1 to level 2. And I think, if I understand correctly, you were saying don't go into scoping and all of the normal stuff that you would put into an agreement with a client. What actually happens? How do you get clear about what the project or the work is? And how do you get agreement on how to go ahead with that?
Well, I think what would happen will be very situational because you are a person and the client is a person. And my notion is that we have these crazy ideas about formulas for contracting or formulas for how things should go. And in fact, my experience is when a client surfaces on the telephone or in an email or so on, I find myself reacting immediately to that particular person in a particular way. And so I found that rules of how personal to be, should you ask questions or should you reveal something about ourselves? You know, what we've just been through is an actual example. I had planned to have my hearing aids in this morning, and you'd never have known that's an issue. But I found it important at the moment when I wasn't able to understand you to personalize the situation by revealing something about myself and saying, well, let's deal with this right now. That immediately changes the relationship automatically. And I think it's that simple, that we don't look for guidelines, that we just play it spontaneously in the moment and discover when you do this with clients that they really kind of like that. They appreciate it, that you're not bureaucratically saying, oh, yes, I understand, and sort of create distance when in fact what you're trying to do is reduce the distance. And then how far you go really is a cultural, we all culturally are very trained not to go too far. We don't immediately ask each other super personal questions. So I think the cultural training we all have, how to be tactful and polite, plays into the process. But it's a choice you have of just how you're going to play the very next time you're in that situation. Does that deal with your question? Good. Good. Hello. Hello.
Oh, hello. I'm very technical, as you can see immediately. Having been a consultant for many years, and I like what you're saying, but I just want to get you a little bit clearer on your conclusion, the last 2 minutes of your presentation that you gave us. So the consultant goes into if a new client, a new situation, and we get to an understanding after maybe saying why a few times and whatever. Here's the problem, whatever it is, and here's what you mean by it. And it's the intervention that I'm questioning, that I'd like to hear you more about. So do we sort of try to get from that first meeting something we could do, a test, that deal with this problem, and we try that, and then we learn from that, and then move forward in a helping relationship. Is that basically so instead of doing an immense diagnostic and whatever, we do a test of in the situation, we actually intervene, learn something, and move from that to other things in step. Is that what I heard you saying, basically?
Yes, and your question, however, reminds me of a critical thing I did not say, which is that the adaptive move, what the consultant does, has to be a joint decision with the client,
Yes.
not an individual decision by the consultant.
Oh, definitely.
And once you accept that idea, that you now say to the client, well, here's what we figured out is the problem. Now, what should be the next move? Because 9 times out of 10, the correct next move is not by the consultant, but by something different that the client should be doing. That's, to me, the big insight. And this is not good for your income, because it often means it does not produce a big project for you, because in formulating the problem, the client often realizes that he or she has the capacity to make that next move and just needed some nudging or some reassurance that what they need to do differently is in fact the key to moving forward. And then you jointly evaluate it, but the part where you said the consultant does something and then evaluate it, that doesn't fit. That's the old model. The consultant may do something if the consultant and the client together agree that the consultant should do something.
Yeah.
But very often that turns out not to be what I find myself agreeing with the client about. In fact, in most of my recent cases where there have been complicated problems, the solution has been something along the lines of the client doing something different. But we both agree on it.
Yes, I agree with what you're saying. It's just really bad for consultants. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Eve Zavel, and I am very familiar with your process consultation book. And in fact, I was trained many years ago in that approach. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting to see the evolution. And I have a question for you. Can you go a little deeper into what it takes from the consultant's position to be a humble consultant?
Okay, very good. What does humility really mean in all of this? And I see two meanings to it. I've always believed that when a client admits to having a problem or wanting some help, that they feel kind of one down. And one reason why I think the consultant has to start with humility is to make the client feel that they're okay. If I come across as I know the answer, that just reinforces the client's one-downness. Whereas if I say, I hear you, but tell me more, I empower the client to become more powerful. The second meaning of humility has to do with my belief that the problems we're solving these days are generally and truly more complicated, and we really don't have an answer. And I think it's very important for the consultant to convey early on to the client that I think I can help you, but I don't have the answer. The problem is too big for both of us. But maybe if we work on it together, we can figure out some adaptive moves that will make you and us feel better that we're approaching some kind of a amelioration or some improvement, or at least a step forward. I think to take that position is the real reason why it's humble consulting rather than some other word. The problems really do humiliate us. They are far more complicated than our theories and our models allow us to. Culture being the best example. There isn't a survey out there that can even approach the true complexity of what a culture really is in terms of all its nuances and all its facets. So the surveyor who says, I've got a culture survey or an engagement survey is being arrogant. They should be humble and say, well, maybe I have some questions here that might get us somewhere. But the notion that you can measure these things is arrogance in the extreme.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Ed, I want to
just going to say, where the hell is Henry?
I just want to make a few personal comments, and then kind of thank you in another way. We go way back to the 1960s when you were faculty and I was a student at the Sloan School at MIT. And then I guess as soon as you heard about Coaching Ourselves, I think I first approached you about that. You have been unbelievably supportive from beginning to, not end, but from beginning to now, and keep going, presumably, and for that we're very, very deeply appreciated.
It's a great program. Sorry? It's a great program.
Yeah, say a word about, I remember that you saw an association with NTL, that this could be the kind of carry-on. Do you want to say a word about that? I remember you explaining that once.
Well, you know, NTL, the invention of the T group, hinged on the idea that neither the researcher nor the participant has all the answers. That somehow the researcher sees something, but the participant in the process sees something different. And the spirit of inquiry, which Warren Bennis and I and others talked about, was let's see where this all leads. And that's essentially where the dialogic OD and Jervis and Bob have come to, that let's recapture that spirit of inquiry and let's the boss and the subordinate or the team members or the consultant and the client engage in a mutual inquiry process to see what we can learn about what's going on out there, which is philosophically totally different from let's figure out through some kind of a measurement process or some diagnostic process what the answer is. Let's work together to figure it out, which to me was the essence of the T group. Is that the connection that you're mindful of, Henry? Is that, I see a direct going back to that spirit of inquiry.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. You know, my thinking at this point is kind of similar. We seem to be always on similar tracks, and in particular these days, I kind of think of these two views as one being very evidence-based and the other being very experience-based. And we've been inundated with evidence. Obviously, all medicine has to be evidence-based as well as experience-based, but all management and management training has to have much more experience in it, and that's where we're both headed and have been for a long time. Just one closing comment or thank you, which is that we appreciated, we all, I think I can speak for everybody, we all appreciated your comments so much, and it resonated with us so much that we have run the entire conference in retrospect around what you just said. So So maybe Phil and me to some extent kind of knew what you were going to talk about, but nobody else did, and yet all their comments for these 2 days and all their questions and everything were exactly in line with what you just presented. So you're actually, this is kind of a starting presentation in a way, even though it's a closing presentation. So thank you very much.
Can I make a final comment?
Sure.
Just to bring us up to date on where the world is going, if you read a book by this doctor, Atul Gawande, called Being Mortal, one of the things that he, as a very well-liked surgeon in the US, is arguing, he did this particularly in a New Yorker article, is that medicine has relied too much on measurement, and in the process has created often misdiagnoses. And it's exactly the same point. The diabetic patient can be measured through all the diagnostic tests and given prescriptions, and yet the cure for diabetes, did I say that? The diabetic patient is the one I'm referring to, might be much better served by a humanized discussion with the doctor of how he or she could change their lifestyle and eat better. So even in medicine, there is some evidence that relying totally on evidence and measurement is missing some of the important elements of what health could and needs to be. I found that very illuminating, that even the doctors are beginning to question whether they've been too impersonal, too much relying on all the tests that are available to them, and not humanizing their relationship with their patients. So with that final note, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. We'll say goodbye.
It was a great pleasure to have a chance to talk about this. Bye.
Everybody in the room so you can see. Goodbye, Ed.
Goodbye.
Bye. So I just want to make some closing personal comments in light of that, and give you a little kind of background to a few things here. When Phil said some time ago, some months ago, that we're running a conference and inviting all these people, I thought, oh my God, you know, do we know how to run conferences? Is this our forte? And how's this going to work out, and so on and so forth. But I don't think I said anything. I just thought, all right. I think I probably did it that way. But I said, okay, we're running a conference. I think, for me personally, I think it's a kind of a turning point in a way. First of all, this is not about a turning point, but I think nobody should ever run a conference with more than about 80 people ever again. Because this is intimate, may be too strong a word, as Ed said, but certainly it just changes the whole dynamic when you're that many people. You get to know everybody, you get to sit down, you get to talk to everybody, you get to interact. The variety of people and interests are quite amazing and quite startling. There are people here who want to try coaching ourselves. There are people here who are users of coaching ourselves. There are people here who are organizing it. There are people who are writing topics, and so on and so forth. And yet seems to be a very strong harmony and kind of consensus about what the issues are and what the concerns are. And so that is very striking. To me, this is one of the best conferences I've ever been to. And I did not organize it. My job in coaching ourselves is to heckle. I just, sort of, say nasty things to Phil once in a while. But to give you a little background on coaching ourselves, after Phil had done his coaching kind of activity within the company, and we decided to set up a company. His original idea, there were 3 kind of partners at that point, and his original idea is we'll just split the shares 3 ways. And I said, no, you should have more shares than everybody else because this is your baby. So I'm a kind of minority shareholder here, but an active one in heckling. I mean, Phil and Warren and Caitlin and Kara do all the hard work, and I heckle. So sort of that's the way it kind of works. I call it a turning point because, or maybe a turning point, because I've spent my entire life kind of tilting at windmills, as they say, or kind of fighting sort of established ways of doing things. And I've done it initially at the managerial level. I just didn't like the way management, a lot of management was being practiced. I did it at the educational level. I didn't like the way managers were being trained. I did it at the organizational level. I didn't like the way organizations were functioning. And now I do it at the societal level. And I always feel like it's always an uphill battle for me. There are always people who support what I have done, but I always feel that I'm kind of, fighting a very, very established thing. And I don't think that it's changed because of 2 days here, but there's a kind of feeling that there's a sort of groundswell made, not about me. I don't mean about what I've been writing. I mean about what all of you think, much as I think, which is there's things that just aren't right in the world, and whether that's the way some organization is running, or the way the United Nations functions, or the way the world is going, or whatever it is. And there's a kind of feeling, I guess, that maybe finally there's going to be enough of an activity to really change that. So maybe there is a kind of turning point. I think that just so many of the sessions and so much of the discussion, so many things that have been going on have been so wonderful. The high point, without any doubt, is always Ole. If you heard Ole's talk, Victor, sort of a Victor Borge talk, if you know what he was doing, but very, very funny, but very, very profound in what he was saying. But that's true of all the presentations. There was so much heart. I don't think I heard a phony word in 3 days. I really don't think I heard a sort of a kind of somebody just spouting something out for its own sake. And I think that's what might have made the conference so good. And I think that's thanks to Phil, who set the tone for it, and the whole staff, Caitlin and Kara and Warren. So I think we should give them a big... So this little experiment in Phil's office way back when he was a real manager, he's a real manager now, believe me, but when he was a real manager then too, maybe sparking something a lot bigger than you ever dreamed. So, just to mention one other thing, I used to joke with Phil that Coaching Ourselves, there could be a party game version of Coaching Ourselves. And by that I mean when you get together with friends for an evening, instead of playing gin rummy or Scrabble or something, or watching a movie, you bring out a Coaching Ourselves topic that's more like dialoguing, and you get a bunch of friends together talking about how we can dialogue better and beyond bickering. After spending dinner kind of challenging each other with little digs, you do a topic called Beyond Bickering. Well, I was somewhat serious in the sense that it could be an evening thing for people, but there also sort of came up during the conference is that Coaching Ourselves could go well beyond organizations. It could go, obviously, into major social issues in the world, but could also go down to just individuals and how we develop ourselves as individuals with our friends, with our family, with everyone else. And it's the same model. And I would guess, Kara may be able to estimate that, I would guess half the topics would probably work. You know, a lot of the topics would work that way. So maybe we're onto something a lot bigger than we think. And so to finalize all that, what else? Was there anything? I wanted to mention the joy in listening to people from Australia and Japan and Denmark and Canada and everywhere else, other places too, just picking this up and doing it in rather different ways, but all in exactly the same spirit. And how people in these 4 or 5 or 6, 8 countries, whatever it is, understand it, get it, but all do it a little bit differently, and it works. It works when there's that kind of spirit and feeling. So for me, this has been like amazing, absolutely amazing. So thank you, Phil. So the way we're going to finish in the spirit of our own methodology, or I don't like that word, but in our own approaches, which is a final topic on change what and how. What's it called? Changing things what and how. And the idea is, okay, what are you going to do with all this? All right, you've heard it all, 2 or 3 days, you've heard plenty. What are you going to do with it? Let me just change one of the little spirits in the way the topic is designed. It's kind of like, what are you personally, singular, thou, and what are we as an organization going to do about it? But I also think you should address, what are we all and other people going to do about these complex, complicated problems that Ed was talking about? Because I think that's part of it. In other words, how are we going to carry this forward to make change, whether it's personal in your own life, organizational in your own organization, in your country, or vis-a-vis the biggest issues we're facing in the world today. So on that note, we'll hand them out.